So the structure for today's event will be that the panelists will answer some questions that I ask, and then we will open it up towards the end for questions from the audience, so please hold your questions until then. And with that, I'd like to let our fabulous panelists introduce themselves. I think we can just go down the line like this. And if you'd like to introduce yourself and how you relate to the topic of labor strikes.
I'm Abigail Shepman. I'm an organizer with Starbucks Workers United, and I work at the downtown Iowa City Starbucks.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Paul Iverson. I'm a labor educator at the University of Iowa Labor Center. I've been a labor educator now for 13 years, but for 22 years before that, I was a lawyer representing unions in Minnesota. So I've been involved in negotiations and strikes for 35 years.
I'm Shel Stromquist. I'm a labor historian and retired professor of history at the University of Iowa. Early in my career, I did quite a lot of work on railroad workers and their strikes back in ancient times. Well, by ancient times, I mean the 19th century. And more recently, I've been working on a project relating to part of which is relating the impact of strikes on politics and the way in which strikes can reshape the political environment, particularly in cities. Looking forward to the discussion today.
My name is Jesse Case. I'm the principal officer of Teamsters Local 238 and an international representative for the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Our local union represents around 150 employers or employees that work at 150 employers, negotiate around 150 contracts in both the private and public sector. We have members in, I think, 87 counties across Iowa. We've had a couple strikes in the last year within our local, and we seem to be always almost on strike every time we go to the bargaining table. So.
All right, thank you all so much. So I was hoping we could get started today by talking about the contemporary context of strikes and what the situation is right now around strikes and organizing.
Hit it, Abigail.
As far as Starbucks Workers United has gone, we've been on a few unfair labor practice strikes. Our store specifically has gone on 3 1 or 2 day unfair labor practice strikes to address issues that were specific to our store and then issues that connected nationally with Starbucks Workers United. Our most recent strike was our Red Cup Day strike, our Red Cup Rebellion. It's hard to describe, but it's basically a day where people can just get like a free red plastic cup with an order, and it is crazy busy. We are never staffed well enough for it. We never have enough product. We are worked far past beyond what we should be worked at for a coffee shop job. And so we went on strike. We joined, I think, over 200 stores nationally at Starbucks Workers United on strike for Red Cup Rebellion. That's all I have for that.
You guys can go down the line. You're already organized.
Let me just start with a little bit of terminology because Abigail threw in unfair labor practice strike. What's that? So when we're in Iowa, if you're talking a strike, you're talking private sector workers, public sector employees. It's illegal for them to strike in Iowa. So we're talking about private sector employers, which are governed by the National Labor Relations Act. And that defines a strike as any concerted work stoppage by employees or concerted interruption of the operations of an employer by employees. The National Labor Relations Act gives rights to employees, not to employers, and actually not to unions, except to the extent that they're representing employees. And so strikes have gone on from as long as there have been workers and there have been employers and there have been disputes, there have been strikes. And so what the National Labor Relations Act does is to set a specific framework for bargaining, but employees have rights. And so there doesn't have to be a union involved, doesn't have to be formal negotiations involved for there to be a strike. typically what we'll be talking about are strikes in the context of negotiations where there is a union involved and the strike is to put pressure on the employer to agree. But the National Labor Relations Act recognizes two different kinds of strikes. One is an economic strike, which is just meant to shut down the employer, to put pressure on the employer to agree to terms in negotiations. The other is what Abigail referred to, an unfair labor practice strike, that if an employer commits an unfair labor practice, they violate the National Labor Relations Act, then you can go on a strike in protest of that unfair labor practice. The difference is because of a 1938 Supreme Court case that made the ridiculous decision that you can't fire people for going on strike. That's illegal under the National Labor Relations Act, but the employer could permanently replace you if you're on strike in order to continue their operation. So the workers are trying to shut down the employer can try to continue to remain open with supervisors or replacements. Well, this idea of being permanently replaced, in law school, we all laugh when they say that you can't be fired, but you can be permanently replaced. But that has been limited to economic strikes. So if you're involved in an unfair labor practice strike, the employer can't permanently replace you. They can hire temporary replacements to do your job while you're on strike, but as soon as you say the strike is over, then they have to give you your job back. And the employees have control over when a strike starts and when a strike ends, and they can decide to go back to work without resolving a contract, or can do short strikes, long strikes. All of the control is in the workers.
That's all really important. I wanted to just kind of broaden the definition of concerted action a bit beyond the kind of legal framework in which it normally is defined and what Paul has been talking about for the most part. Workers have used what power they could muster at the workplace in a variety of ways, even when they didn't have recognition as a union or the ability to formally shut down the workplace. So I think it's important to think in terms of concerted action taking a variety of additional forms. And the ones that occur to me are things like a slowdown, which represents a significant exercise of power in the workplace by workers that's concerted, but which doesn't result in a formal withdrawal of labor. It's an informal, but nonetheless quite effective tool that workers historically have used. Wildcat strikes are technically under the Taft-Hartley Act prohibited. That is where workers, when a contract is not up, nevertheless are faced with grievances and say, this is unacceptable, we're not getting any redress here, we're going out on strike. That's technically illegal, and yet it's done quite frequently, and it's a challenge to employers in terms of whether they are going to bring the weight of the law down on workers for that kind of concerted action or not. Absenteeism is a form of not necessarily collective action, although it could be at times, where workers withdraw their labor as a matter of informal protests about the conditions they're faced with. Sabotage is not something we talk about in a formal way.
Not a protected concerted
It's not
activity.
a protected concerted action, but it's certainly something that workers, in the absence of formal recognition or power, have used to let the employer know that the actions that he's taking with respect to his employees is unacceptable. So there are, I think it's important to bear in mind there are a variety of ways in which workers can exercise their power in the workplace apart from the formal collective bargaining framework. I do want us to talk about the conditions today that are bringing about what seems to be a significant rise in strike activity. But why don't we hear from Jesse, and then maybe at some point we can come back to that.
Or I could just segue into that. I mean, so there have been more strikes in the last couple of years than recent history, and there have also been better contract resolutions in the last couple of years than we've seen in recent history. We're always looking for resolution. We're usually looking for resolution. We're not usually looking for a strike. Workers strike when they're kind of at their wits' end and where we feel like we can't get a good agreement. But in the last couple of years, the contracts that we have settled, which are a vast majority of them, we've seen record increases, 20% increases at the bargaining table, 15%, 10%, where for years it was 2% and 3%. And there are driving forces on that, one being the pandemic, where workers didn't fall for that essential worker bullshit. Like they said, everyone's an essential worker, and we had people who were hauling medical supplies to hospitals, which could easily fall under that category. And we also represent the toothbrush factory in town, who is considered essential workers. But very few workers actually got extra pay for being an essential worker and putting their families and themselves at risk by going to work during a pandemic. So we caught on to that very quickly. We actually had employers asking to open contracts and take things back during the pandemic, like Hy-Vee. We represent 600 workers at the Hy-Vee warehouse in Sheraton. They actually tried to open the contract and take things away from workers while Hy-Vee's profits were skyrocketing. Nobody was eating out at restaurants. You couldn't. Everyone was cooking at home. So the pandemic was certainly a driving force in this new era of bargaining. Another driving force is the so-called labor shortage. There's not really a labor shortage. There's a wage shortage, and workers are caught onto that too. When your boss talks all day long about how they can't keep employees or recruit employees, and then they go to the bargaining table and try to nickel and dime you, our bargaining committees are sitting there going, we know that you can't recruit workers. We know that there's a recruitment problem and a retention problem, and we're going to leverage that at the bargaining table. It gives us more leverage than we've had in decades. And it's not that we woke up and there were suddenly 4 million fewer workers in the American workforce. There were 4 million fewer workers who were willing to work full-time and not be able to pay their bills. So there's the same amount of workers. There's just fewer workers who are willing to get screwed over for large corporations whose profits are soaring while wages are stagnant. So we've really enjoyed the last couple of years bargaining. Workers are more likely to be willing to go on strike. Employers know it, and it gives us really results in better contracts. So we're enjoying the perhaps temporary dynamics at the bargaining table that we're seeing right now.
Permanent. Mm-hmm. We're going to make it permanent.
Well, that's the goal. We seem to be, every time we go to the bargaining table, I mentioned in the introduction that if we're not on strike, we're almost on strike. We may have a strike here in Iowa City in the spring. We just had 57 truck drivers at UNFI organized last week at United Natural Foods. We don't expect that to be an easy bargaining session, so we're going to go into that planning a strike and hope we don't have to go there. We just settled a contract that looked like we were going to go on strike up in the Mason City area for 110 manufacturing workers, and we almost struck the Iowa City School District, the bus drivers, just this past a few months ago. So if we're not on strike, and you never hear about settlements that where we get a contract because we were ready to go on strike. You only hear about settlements when we do go on strike. When we represent negotiate 150 contracts, our local might have 4 pending strikes at any given time, and if they all get settled, you're not going to read about that in the paper. But if we're not willing to go there, then it affects our bargaining power. Our local union is always strike ready, and every year we get more and more strike ready as we dust the cobwebs off. We've got a just a unbelievable amount of burn barrels in the back of our union hall in case we have to go on strike. And then we, of course, support other unions when they're on strike. In the last year, the steelworkers have been on strike here in Iowa, in Eldridge. The UAW's been on strike in Newton and Burlington. The Teamsters have been on strike in Cedar Rapids and Des Moines, and of course the Starbucks workers here in Iowa City. So these are not rare occurrences. These strikes are happening more than people think, and it's good. It's changing the bargaining dynamic.
I wanted to just build briefly on something that Jesse was talking about, and it does seem to me that historically strikes have tended to come in waves. That is, they're clusters of strikes that kind of feed off of each other in some ways, a sense of solidarity, a sense of possibility that workers are seeing around them. And there are several factors that contribute to those waves, it seems to me, and people who've written about this have tried to identify what those consistent factors are. But clearly one of them is when new workers, not new workers, new to organization workers, kind of get the union bug and recognize that they have rights and that they can organize around those rights. And so, for instance, in the 1880s and 90s, unskilled workers were largely unrepresented in craft unions, and yet had increasing hardships that required redress. And so these unskilled workers, unorganized workers, really fueled the strike wave of the 1880s and 90s that really trying to change the dynamic of American labor in fundamental ways. In the 1930s, it was the children of new immigrants who were in basic manufacturing, in rubber and auto and steel, who were a new generation of unrepresented workers in American industry who drove forward this industrial organizing that was new. And likewise today, Abigail represents a generation of workers in sectors of the economy that have not been represented in the past by unions, and who see the possibilities of changing their conditions at work by organizing unions. And so this kind of energy that a new generation of younger workers in parts of the economy that haven't been previously organized, I think is contributing to the kind of surge we're seeing right now.
Yeah, well, let Abigail talk about that a bit, because that is one thing old guys like me would say: you can't organize coffee shop workers, fast food workers, there's too much turnover. How did you go about organizing? What made you think you could do it?
I think Jesse touched on something which was really integral to Starbucks Workers United, was the pandemic. People calling us like essential workers, fast food workers especially. People couldn't go into restaurants. They were still getting fast food, still going through drive-thrus, still exposing the workers. And the workers were saying, we want protection for ourselves, for our family. And so I think it was Buffalo workers at Starbucks decided it's not going to get any better unless we make it better. And that's when the unionizing really started. For us in Iowa City, being able to see Starbucks workers across the country start to unionize, we realized this isn't just a one-off thing. This is something we can do. And I think it touches a lot on what you were just saying, Shell, about seeing people do it and understanding that we're at a moment where we do have the energy, the motivation, and we've seen it in Teamsters, auto workers. Everyone says, how can you unionize this industry? But that's what they've said about any industry that's been unionized before. You just try until you do it. That's, I think, a lot of what we go off of when we do this.
Yeah, and I think that's just an incredibly important point is, a lot of the factory jobs that we think of as good jobs were crappy jobs until the workers organized and turned them into good jobs. And so, we say, well, there's all this turnover because it's not a very good job. You do it while you're in school, you graduate from school, you get a better job. But all of you getting together can turn those jobs into good jobs.
And someone needs to do them, so. why not protect us while we do it?
All right, well, I was just wondering if you could talk a little about, you've all touched on the preparing for strikes and what goes into a strike, like, just a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of that. If Abigail or Jesse, if you wanted to speak about that.
Well, I'm very new to it. Yeah, locally, I've prepared for strikes by following like Starbucks Workers United. They have really great organizers who are able to like teach us as we go on how to prepare for strikes. Like the very basics that we know are to turn in a strike notice and let them know that we'll come back to work on a certain day and time. Yeah, for me, it's just like making sure everyone in my store specifically knows that this is the reason we're striking. You have a say in this. You have a vote on if you want to strike. And then we just have to get ready by like making signs, which for a place like Starbucks, where a lot of people are very creatively inclined, is like the best part. Everyone really likes to make signs. And then we also love to like get out there and actually be on the picket line and talk to students walking by and help them understand like why we're on strike. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, anytime we're looking at a strike, we're assuming it may be a prolonged strike, which takes a lot of preparation. And I like these rolling strikes too, because they're quick hits like the UAW did and like Starbucks is doing. Those are very effective because it keeps the employer off guard. But a strike like we had last year at King's Material, which was a cement company, concrete company in Cedar Rapids, you know, just the planning that goes into that, there's things that maybe the public doesn't think of. Where, if you're going to have people on a picket line for 6 hours or 8 hours, where are they going to go to the bathroom? If it's going to be 100 degrees out or 10 degrees out, what about shelter from the sun or the elements, the rain, the snow? What about law enforcement? Do you need a permit to picket? Do you need a permit to put up a tent? Do you need a permit for a burn barrel? Do you need a permit? You know, a lot of times you'll have the cop, you'll meet the cops out there in order to see where you can picket. That's also signaling to the company that you're going to picket. So sometimes we just ask the police to meet us in front of a place, not only to show us where to picket, but to let the company know this is where we will be next Tuesday, in case you don't already know. We got in a fight with the city and King's Material. We had a tent set up. They claimed we needed a permit. The cops made us take our tent on. We pulled up an RV. Within hours, they said we didn't. Our vehicle was too long, so that we argued that for a day. As we pulled that out, we pulled another vehicle in that was in. So just in terms of keeping our infrastructure, our camp infrastructure set up, we have to plan ahead. And a lot of times that's just delegating. The media is going to show up. Who's in charge of the messaging for the strike? Things like signs, things like water. If you're going to have people at the water, remember one year we were helping BCTGM, another union in Cedar Rapids, do a rally at Ingredion, and we'd invited Bernie Sanders, and it was going to be 105 degrees that day. So who's going to bring the tent and make sure that Bernie Sanders is not sitting out in 100 degree, standing out there for 4 hours in 100-degree heat. Just logistics like that. It can be, but if you plan ahead and figure out all the logistics, and we have a strike prep sheet that we can sit in a staff meeting and say, these are the areas we need to hit and coordinate, and we need coordinators on each one of these areas. So there's a lot of planning that goes into a strike, and including legal. If you don't notify the Federal Mediation and Conciliatory Services 30 days ahead of time and you strike the employer, we may be committing an unfair labor practice. So things like that. The lawyers, we always have lawyers involved because we're always going to get sued, or the employer's always calling the cops or taking us to court or whatever. So we just have to be ready for those contingencies as well.
And as a lawyer, I used to get involved in that, where you can legally picket. You can only picket on public property. You can't go on private property, and where, what entrances the employer you can strike at or not. There's all sorts of legal things but a lot of the things that I got involved with were kind of higher level is like, where are our leverage points? Who, because one of the things is, like if you look at the John Deere strike, it was so successful because they were skilled employees that couldn't easily be replaced. So you had 10,000 people out on strike, but there was no way that John Deere could hire 10,000 people that could put out the combines and tractors and cotton pickers and all of the equipment that they did. And so that was something we would look at on a high level is, okay, what workers do we have? What pressure points are there? What's the best time to strike? How long can you strike? So we get involved in some of those more upper level strategic things. And then the locals never wanted me to get involved in logistics. So we talked about the upper level stuff, and they got into where are the burn barrels and who's going to be a strike captain and how much time are people going to be actually at the picket line.
This is all really important and strategically necessary, particularly in the legal environment in which unions have to operate today. But I think it's important to bear in mind that there's also historically been a really important ingredient of spontaneity and of there's calculation and there's strategic planning, but there's also a certain enthusiasm and audacity that comes into play at moments that aren't planned for or that aren't predicted. And I just mentioned a couple. One is the famous sit-down strikes against GM in 1937. Nobody had very carefully planned, we're going to do this. But they saw the company beginning to move strategic parts out of the plant, and workers simply got together and said, we've got to shut this plant down, and we're going to shut it down by sitting in the plant, not going out on the picket line. And in the process, it wasn't an entirely new strategy, but it was pretty new, and it spread pretty widely because people suddenly realized there is strategic value in occupying the plant, not in removing ourselves from the plant. The 1912 textile strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, that women ignited when their wages were cut as a result of a legally mandated cut in hours, happened spontaneously. Women simply said, we're not going to accept a wage cut. And they went from factory to factory and called people out, and suddenly there were 25,000, 30,000 workers out on strike that hadn't been formally planned or organized ahead of time. So I think there's in the kind of moment we're in, there's a certain kind of contagion, I like to think of it, as where this enthusiasm for the possibilities of the strike begins to spread into new circles and new sectors, and people realize that they actually have more power than they might have thought they have, and they act on that.
Well, thank you. I was really curious how we've talked about these individual strikes being successful, how this is leading to what seems like a real revival of the labor movement, and if we are going through a kind of labor renaissance right now.
Do you want to start?
I don't think I can speak on a labor renaissance. I'm just...
There's an interesting thing with collective action. So the power of workers getting together, they have an incredible amount of power, but motivated, effective collective doesn't just show up. So there's the actions of a number of individuals that get up every morning and say, today I'm going to fight for justice, and then just keep doing it and keep doing it. And I think when you talk about the individual strikes, the way that they feed off, it's the individuals getting into a larger collective. So you take the individual workers at one employer and they say, damn it, we're not going to take it anymore. And then they're successful, and 3 other places see, well, they did it over there, and so it has a tendency to build on itself. And when there was a big strike wave in the early 1930s that led to the National Labor Relations Act, the union membership tripled over the next 10 years. And I think we're at that kind of an inflection point where in poll after poll, over 60% of people say that they would be in a union if they could. And yet in the private sector in the United States, 6% are. And so now we're at this point that workers are starting to realize the power that they have after being beaten down for so long, and that gets contagious. And we'll have to see when we come back 10 years from now what has happened, but we could be on the verge of that kind of resurgence that we've seen just a few times in the past.
Yeah, I think there is a renaissance going on in labor, and I think it's a reaction to the fascism and the corporate greed that workers are feeling. I mean, some of us do get out of bed every morning, and we're activists, and that's what we do. But we've been having focus groups with our members in rural counties around the state and talking about issues to see, you know, regardless of party, regardless of background, regardless of employer, regardless of where they live, if the issues are, you know, what our members are thinking. And workers are starting to feel the effects of this world we're living in. I mean, everyone knows that, you know, their voucher program was passed, and they're sucking billions of dollars out of our public schools, but not many people realize that 150 rural schools have closed in Iowa, 150. Everyone knows there's a healthcare crisis, but a lot of people don't know that 175 rural hospitals have closed in Iowa. They cut $30 million out of children's mental health funding just this last legislative session, $30 million less for children's mental health. Nursing homes just came out, were 49 out of 50 in the country. Bridges, 50 out of 50. So if you're living in a small town and your kids' school's being underfunded and you have a mental health crisis in your family that's not being addressed, and you've got, you know, shitty roads and bad infrastructure, and your wages have been stagnant since your parents worked in that plant, the system is not working for you. And so at some point, you're kind of forced to figure out how to fight back, and the best way to do that is through concerted and collective action. So we're seeing, you know, that, you know, if we're in the right place at the right time, we have to be ready when workers are ready to push back. Because a lot of times, you know, we can fight amongst ourselves here in Johnson County, and while our you know, differences are, you know, this wide, you go down to Appanoose County or you go down to Lucas County where we have those 600 Hy-Vee warehouse workers and truck drivers. They actually live in 8 surrounding counties that are very red, and you start asking even our Republican members, you know, what they think of school funding. They're mad. They're mad. We had one steward in Appanoose in Centerville, Iowa, who's the only Republican in the room. The rest of them were non-party and libertarians, and he was extremely upset that they've closed the shop program at his kid's school, and now they're going to suck out more money from the teachers and from other programs. So that leads to new organizing. It's, you know, when workers see other workers stand up, that's contagious. Just like apathy is contagious, so's action. And we're seeing the effects of, you know, the cuts in unemployment, the cuts in work comp, the stagnant wages, the cuts in healthcare, the cuts in schools. All this is leading to the renaissance. So I don't know if it's a renaissance as much as it is just people have had enough and they're starting to push back. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a couple of other factors that I think are contributing to this renewal. One is that unions like the UAW have seen the birth of a new kind of rank and file movement that was determined to reverse the trend of the recent past in terms of givebacks, and began to challenge the existing leadership. Eventually elected their own members to those leadership positions, and those leaders have now taken that mandate of this rank and file movement into the contract negotiations and the hugely successful strike that we've just witnessed. And they're doing that based on kind of renewing the union from below by reunionizing their own members in terms of their commitment to the core principles that the union stands for. The other point I would mention, and this is something Jesse mentioned earlier, is that this renewal is taking place in a context where there's a new discourse and a new consciousness about inequality that everybody, almost everybody, understands, and it's at the core of what the UAW was fighting for, what the Teamsters have been fighting for. That we've been through a period where workers have been giving back, and inequality has been growing, and it's time now to redress that imbalance. I thought it was really interesting to see Sean Fain, the new president of the UAW, being interviewed on one of the national cable networks, and he appeared on the set wearing a T-shirt. What did the T-shirt say? Eat the rich. He wasn't mincing words. He understood that the people he was speaking to recognized that the inequalities that have been driving this economy have to be redressed. And the other thing I would just mention about Sean Fain, because I'm afraid I won't get a chance later, is that he was being interviewed on Chris Hayes' MSNBC show. And Chris said, wow, congratulations, you guys have done a fantastic job. You've got a new contract, and the contract is going to be up for renewal in 4 years, right? And Sean Fain said, no, 4.5 years. And Chris Hayes looked a little puzzled. 4.5 years? And he said, yeah, we're going to renew. We've negotiated renewal of the contract on May 1st, 2028. And it wasn't entirely clear that Chris Hayes understood the significance of that date. But he also went on to say that we're going to suggest that other workers in other sectors push for renewal of their contracts on May 1st. And the implication was, and clearly Sean Fain knew this history, that May 1st, 1886 was the famous general strike for the 8-hour day that brought together workers across all sectors of the economy. And whether he had exactly that in mind or not, I don't know. But in any case, he found that history of worker solidarity across industries and within unions very instructive.
All right. This has all been really fascinating. So people in the audience are maybe wondering, though, how can they get involved and help workers who are going on strike and become involved? So I was wondering if you all could speak to that a little bit, of things they could do.
For us, I think it's still really important that people even know that Starbucks has a growing union movement. Talking about it online, offline is great. Just like getting the word out, especially Iowa City. We're the only unionized Starbucks in Iowa so far. It's really important that other stores know that this is something that's very possible for them and that will work for them. And yeah, if we do go on strike, showing up to the picket line would be great. We understand that not everyone can make it all the time, so just like talking about it, getting the word out would be really cool.
Yeah, I think, the message is don't just be a supporter of labor, be a friend. And a friend is there, with getting your back when things are tough. And so it's amazing when I show up at picket lines how much the rank and file employees just love that somebody has taken an interest in them and show up. And if you show up with pizza and water, things that they need, that's even better. And like on the Deer picket line when I was there early on, somebody from a Quick Star station nearby brought 6 pizzas. Well, obviously, somehow the word got to Casey's, because about half an hour later, someone from Casey's showed up with 6 more pizzas. And so that public support, you can see it in people's faces, and they stand a little taller, they puff out their chest a little more, they start to feel their power. And, so just showing up for people is vitally important. But also, if you have somebody that has a pulpit to speak from, to be part of the the voice that says, hey, this is going on, this is important. Writing letters to the editor, putting it on your social media, actively showing that we're all part of it, because we're all workers. And I don't think there might be somebody in the room that is a multi-billionaire that owns a corporation, but most of us are workers, and all workers are in this together. And so just stick together, be in solidarity with wherever the fight is. That's where we're going, and that's what we're going to be part of.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said. I mean, I do think it's important to be politically engaged too, and to elect people to office who are going to be union friendly and who are going to support public policies that help strengthen, not undermine unions. I think when you go into Starbucks or another coffee shop, saying to the employees, if you guys organize a union, I'll be there to support you. Just those little gestures, I think, can be very heartening. The other thing I would just mention is that, some years back, the Johnson County Board passed a new minimum wage law ordinance that was setting the minimum wage at that time at $10.10 in Johnson County. Sounds pretty low now, but the state government came in and said, the legislature said, you can't do that. You can't set a county minimum wage. You gotta abide by the state $7.25 wage. And so CWJ, the Center for Worker Justice, went out into the community to businesses and said, we know you don't have to pay $10.10 an hour, but we're asking you to do that in support of low-wage workers in the community who desperately need that income. And put a sign in your window that says, yes, we will support the minimum wage even though we don't have to do that. It's that kind of community support building, whether in support of striking workers or in support of public policies that are going to benefit workers, that I think is really important.
Yeah, I think, voting for the right people, honoring boycotts, going to rallies, going to picket lines, and that's all very important. That's all, strikes, are successful based on the public support. We've had strikes that we've waved off where we've told our members, this is not the right time because for certain reasons, and we need to, maybe our membership's low and our wages are pretty high, and we're not going to be able to convince the public that $30 an hour jobs are bad jobs when really maybe there's a safety issue or something. So we have to spend the next couple of years building capacity in order to strike at the right time. But I would also say that if you see that there's a strike happening, which is going to be on the news, anybody goes on strike, it's going to be front page, it's going to be on the news. But then, and that's when you get a lot of donations, that's when you get a lot of support, that's when you get a lot of people coming by, that's when you see the rallies. But then 2 or 3 weeks later, if that strike continues, nobody's coming by, the food dries up, it's very lonely on the picket line. You go from all the workers on the picket line to shifts. So you might be on the picket line with 3 people as opposed to 30 people. And if you're out there for 6 hours, it's lonely and maybe cold and maybe you're bored and it's just whatever. So it's okay to stop by a picket line. If you stop by a picket line, if you see a strike in the news and it's still going on, you haven't seen that it's settled in 3 weeks, it's okay to go by, drive by there and stop. Then no one's going to say, what are you doing here on our picket line? If you stop and go, hey, do you have a sign I can carry? They're going to go, yes, we do. And even if walking the picket line for an hour isn't your thing, you stop by with a pie, you stop by with a case of water, you stop by with a gas card or whatever it is, people are going to appreciate it, and they'll talk about it. It's just a quick shot in the arm, because it can get very lonely very quick on a picket line. A lot of people go on strike and they're hoping for a quick resolution, and the employer, once we go there, the employer is going to try to starve. They're going to try to cause people to suffer. So it's very unusual for an employer to come to a quick resolution, because they don't want to train the union or train the members that all they have to do next time is go on strike for 3 days and we get what we want. We might go on strike planning for hoping that we ended in 3 days, and the employer's like, no, this is going to be 3 weeks, or this is going to be 3 months. Because when we did our strike this summer in Amcor in Des Moines, that was a $13 billion company, $13 billion. And they can wait it out. They can lose a lot of money if they want to punish workers for standing up for their rights. That was a case where we had 110 workers, 109 of them were union members, and 110 went on strike, and 110 stayed out. Like, it was an incredible, and I can tell you that the community support is what kept them on the street. It was morale was not an issue because of the public support, people driving by and honking. There were so many cars honking as they went by, and that was just a shot in the arm. Small stuff goes a long ways, whether it's stopping by. Call the union and ask if the union needs anything. The first 2 weeks, they're going to say, we got everything we need. We got more than we can handle. We don't know what to do with all this food. 3 weeks into it, 4 weeks into it, people need diapers, people need formula, people need food, people need water, so it's okay to call the union and say, hey, what do your striking members need? And it's more important to call them a couple weeks into it than a couple days into it, I think.
Thank you all. And now I wanted to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you just raise your hand, just wait for the microphone to come to you, please.
My question is about strike funds from the unions. And my impression is that not every union has the bank account to do that. Some do, and it's for various lengths. But I've always been curious how much would workers get out of a strike fund, and how important is that in, we were talking about preparation for strikes.
I could talk about it in a broad legal sense, with the number of unions, and it varies from union to union. It's part of the international constitution. Most unions set up a strike fund, and usually you can get payments out of the strike fund if you're actively participating in the strike. So in order to get payments out of the fund, you show up at the picket line. Usually, it's common. I shouldn't say it's common. Some are like $250 a week, so you're not going to live off of it. And when you're on strike, you're not entitled to unemployment because the employer says, well, we let you work, but you're refusing to work. So, it's all, it varies a lot, but most of the unions that I worked with had strike funds in their international constitution, and then it was just divided up according to the terms of the Constitution. I don't know if you want to say anything, Jesse? Or...
Yeah, I think Paul's right. You're not going to get rich going on strike, and that's, nobody goes on strike to make money. They go on strike in order to improve standards, which may be an increase in wages down the road. But you're gonna, and especially a prolonged strike. It's also where the public comes in. It's also where other unions come in. It's not, we have a large strike fund within the Teamsters nationally because it's a large union, but our workers are going to get a couple hundred a week. It's not enough, but we try to close the gap between what they would normally make and what the strike fund is, and that might be with groceries. It might be with other, if you bank at our credit union, we freeze your loan payments during the course of it. If you're part of the Teamsters Health Insurance, Health and Welfare Fund, if you have our insurance in your contract, the premiums are frozen, but you still have insurance while you're on strike. If you don't have the union health insurance, the employer is going to cut your insurance off generally. So now your family's without insurance and food. But a lot of times, if our local goes on strike, and if it's a week or two, that we can workers a lot of times can absorb that. If you're going to be on strike for 6 months or something, then you have to figure out how do we start supplementing incomes, and that can be very expensive. If you got 100 people on strike, that's a lot of resources. But if we can make it up through food, if we can make it up through lowering their monthly expenses at home in other economic ways, and then it's not uncommon for us to be sending resources to other local unions that are on strike. When the Ingredion was on strike last year, we had an event with Kevin Burt and Art Cullen and raised $16,000 for their strike fund, because it's, that's what we do. When our local goes on strike, other Teamster locals will send a lot of resources. So we can build up tens of thousands of dollars very quickly. You can also pay out tens of thousands of dollars very quickly within days or weeks. So that's always the trick, is how do we feed people who are on strike?
I'm curious about the focus groups that you're having out in the rural communities. Who are they angry at? Because, the state couldn't get any redder, I don't think. And I remember the last presidential election, we were told this is the most important election we ever have had. I think this next one is even more important. And so I wonder, are they going to vote to change anything, or do you talk about that?
Yeah, they're not. That's why we're talking about issues and not parties in rural parts of the state, because when we talk about parties, they tune out instantly. When we talk about issues, they're on it. When we talk about schools and healthcare and infrastructure, they're on it and they're pissed. But one of the things we're doing is acknowledging that the two-party system's broken, and I know at least one of the parties hate it when we do this. But when we go into Appanoose County or Lucas County and we get our activists together, and there aren't any Democrats in the room, which is what we're finding out, is and we talk about a broken political system, or we say raise your hand if you don't have a mental health crisis in your family, and 100% of the time there's almost a consensus that the system is broken. And if you're living in a county that has no Democrats elected and only Republicans, and you admit that the system's not working for you, you're essentially admitting that the Republican Party's not working for you, because you're living in a one-party county, just like we're outside of Johnson and a couple other counties, we're living in a one-party state. So acknowledging that the system is not working for everybody, and I had the chair of a major party in this state tell me within the last 2 months, system's not broken. It's just people don't vote. And again, I said, well, if you're living in Centerville and your wages are stagnant, and your schools are underfunded, and you have a healthcare crisis, the system is not working for you. So what our goal is to mobilize people around issues who are and just having these discussions with them. What's important to you? When we ask them what's important, they're saying the meth problem in town. They're saying in Keokuk, we surveyed 350 people. Potholes was the #1 issue. In Centerville, it was dilapidated houses, but it was also school funding and mental health. We did a survey. We surveyed our entire membership statewide, and on these issues that I talk about, but also said what's important to you, what's going on in your community, and kind of surprisingly, mental health and school funding, the same issues that we're. So we're using these focus groups to see if we're on the right track, or if it's just a bubble that we're living in, that we think that these are important issues to us, but in the field or across Iowa and rural counties. We did it because we were tired of, frankly, the parties saying, we're going to do focus groups and find out what people think in rural Iowa. So every time we meet with our members, we have a focus group. And the fact that they're already paying dues to our members means they're going to be more honest with us than a New York consulting firm flying into Centerville, Iowa, and asking strangers what they think. We can get them in a room and buy them a beer and go, what do you think of school funding? And they go, that's bullshit. So what do you think we should do about it? And now, next time that their legislator has a public forum on a Saturday at their public library, we can turn out people over those issues. When we talk about party, we lose them. When we talk about issues, they want to know where to sign up to fight. So we're getting a lot out of these focus groups, and including confirmation that issues are important across party lines, but also matching activists with issues. When we say, would you come to a meeting on infrastructure? Would you come to a meeting on healthcare? Would you come to a meeting on school funding? Over 50% of our members are saying yes, regardless of party. which means we can start mobilizing people to raise hell against people who are voting to cut these issues. So we're identifying issues, we're identifying activists, and then we're using the focus groups to come up with local messaging and local strategies, because we're not going to be able to tell our factory workers in Centerville what's going to work in Centerville. So they have to be included in the strategy. So I don't know if that answered your question, but we're getting a lot out of it.
Hey, I do have a question, but first I was also going to make an offer just as an addendum to the last question that you asked about how people can support workers on strike and be engaged, which is, in addition to all the perfect answers that the panelists gave, I didn't bring my clipboard, but I maintain the email list for the Iowa City Federation of Labor. So of course the best way to get engaged is to join and form organizations. So you can do that in a coordinated way. And if you would like to be added to that list, we do coordinate and support, when Abby keeps us in the loop when they're going to go on strike, and we let people know. And we've been hosting solidarity actions on a monthly basis for Starbucks workers, and we'll continue to do that until they start getting a fair contract. And if the UNFI newly organized workers go on strike, we'd support them, et cetera. So if folks are interested in that, you can write your email address down before you go, and we'll add you to the list. My question is, if the panelists are willing to speak a little bit to what it's, one of the elephants in the room in our discussion is the reality that, well, this is a moment unlike any in my lifetime in terms of energy and enthusiasm about unions, an uptick in strikes, an uptick in new organizing, especially in the private sector. We're living in a state where we have thousands of workers who have no right to strike, and not only have no right to strike, but have had their bargaining rights almost eliminated if they're in the public sector. So if they work for our school districts, cities, counties, states. Public library, that's right. And so, to what extent are you, and I know we've got folks who work closely with a lot of public sector workers in Iowa and public sector unions. So, if you could all speak a little bit to, what the contradiction and the reality that we've got a real momentum building and record contract settlements in many cases in the private sector, while we're also living in a moment when many of our public sector unions in Iowa are struggling to hang on to the, what is left of their contracts and survive because our state legislation has become so repressive in terms of their rights.
So what's the question?
Is any of this momentum and energy carrying over to trying to fight back and win back rights for public sector?
Ultimately, yes. One of the things, our movement has never been defined by laws. There were unions before there were laws that said they could be, and they were negotiating contracts, and they were putting pressure on employers, and they were making workers' lives better. And the legislature gutted Chapter 20, the public sector labor law, on what is mandatory subjects of bargaining, but they did not take away people's rights to concerted activity. And so we just have to change the strategy, and some unions are doing that. And the state is going to do what Kim Reynolds says, but local governments are susceptible to pressure and have been agreeing to bargain over more things. But I think some of the things that Jesse was talking about, we just may need to have candidates that support worker issues but are independent, that don't have a party label. And there are some places like Keokuk and Dubuque and Appanoose County where you can elect people that support workers' issues but don't have a party label. Then what happens when you have a certain number of Republicans, a certain number of Democrats, and then this worker bloc? What does that do to the political dynamics in the state?
I also think that, unions used to be much more than collective bargaining agreements where, we used to be in the neighborhoods and fighting for families, and if your family had a crisis, whether it was with the police or the gang, the union could be there as a resource. If your family was hungry, the union was there as a resource. And over the years, we were redefined by our opposition to be grievance factories as opposed to a movement. As Paul said, you can't legislate a movement out of existence, right? It's like our movement goes on regardless of the laws. But it's also why it's really important to tell our members what we stand for outside of the bargaining table. We need to be fighting on the shop floor, but also in the neighborhoods. So when our unions know that we're fighting for school funding, for mental health funding, for rural hospitals, if your town does not have, healthcare and schools and infrastructure, no one's moving there, and your town's going to die, and that's what we're seeing across Iowa. When we roll into our rural communities and talk to our members about these issues, no one else is coming in asking them what they think or if they're willing to fight. So if they associate their union with social issues, and there are a lot of there's a problem in this state where labor thinks they can't talk to their members about politics. We can talk about school funding, we can talk about healthcare, we can talk about mental health, we can talk about bridges and nursing home inspections, and when those are issues that resonate outside of the bargaining sessions with the families of our members. So if we can fight for issues that resonate at home as well as the workforce, I think that's what keeps the labor movement strong. And membership is down in the public sector. There are fewer contracts, and that was their design. But we're also, our local union had 36 elections this few weeks ago, because every year before your contract expires, members have to vote to keep their union in. It's state-sponsored union busting. We had 36 elections. We won 36 elections. And some workers have been, contracts have been stripped and whatever, but we're winning these elections, universally across Iowa, public sector unions at 97, 98%, which are incredible numbers, because workers are, even though at a time when they're getting beat down, they're still willing to not go, to stand up. And so Kim Reynolds doesn't get to decide if we have a union or whatever. So I think just, what is a labor union? Is it only collective bargaining? The employer will beat you at that, because they take our activists and turn them into bureaucrats, file a grievance, and then 2 weeks from now you're going to have a meeting and whatever. But if they know that we're fighting on the street for other larger issues that affect their family, or other issues that affect their family, then we're defining what our movement is, not the employer.
Yeah, and I think that, again, historically, the kind of renewal of the labor movement has bled over into politics in ways that have really made a profound difference. And I think there's no reason not to think that's not going to happen now. But it's important to begin at the local level and to be running people for city council and school board and other local offices, both to protect unions, but also to carry these issues that we have as union members into the community, and to fight for the things that people need in their day-to-day lives outside of the workplace. And so, I'm optimistic that if we pour our energy into this kind of local politics, that we can really begin to build a movement statewide that will ultimately have some impact.
And that union busting law that the Republicans passed for the public sector workers really, forced us to communicate with our members more. It forced us to be a little more militant and to provide good representation. They're going to vote us out if we don't provide good representation. We'll see our membership shrink. Our membership hasn't gone down at all in our local union in the last 5 years. But the way we do business has changed. We're more engaging with our members. We're in the field more, and we have to listen to what our members want. So it's actually forced. I talk to people who don't live in right-to-work states, and if maybe the laws change and then they're freaked out. When you live in a right-to-work state, you have to service your membership, and if you don't, your members go down. If you service it, doesn't matter what the state does. There's going to be some negative effects, but it's really just about member engagement. The more active our members are, the stronger our local union is.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our panelists.